Lisa Carter had always believed that her family was sacred. It was the foundation of her life, the one thing that had remained steady through every hardship, every triumph, every passing year. The house she and Jerome had bought together stood in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Bakersfield, a modest yet comfortable place with a neatly trimmed lawn and a front porch where she would sit on warm evenings, sipping tea and listening to the distant hum of crickets. It was the kind of home where the smell of cinnamon lingered in the kitchen, where laughter echoed through the halls on Sunday mornings, where the walls were lined with framed photographs capturing moments of love and joy. Her mother, Vanessa, had always been a constant presence in her life. A strong, resilient woman, she had raised Lisa alone, working tirelessly to provide for her. Even after Lisa had grown up, gotten married, and started a life of her own, Vanessa remained close, offering guidance, support, and a shoulder to lean on. When Lisa and Jerome had children, Vanessa had been there to help, taking on the role of a doting grandmother with effortless grace. Lisa had never questioned their bond, had never doubted the love that existed between them. That night, she returned home earlier than planned. The hospital had been quiet, an unusual occurrence, allowing her to leave before her shift was officially over. She had driven through the dimly lit streets, looking forward to an evening spent in the comfort of her home. She imagined walking through the front door, the scent of home-cooked food filling the air, Jerome greeting her with a kiss on the cheek, Vanessa smiling from her favorite spot on the couch. It was an image she had clung to, an expectation so deeply ingrained in her routine that she never thought to question it. When she pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The house was dark except for a single light glowing from the upstairs bedroom window. Normally, there would be signs of life, a television flickering in the living room, the soft murmur of voices, the sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen. But tonight, there was only silence. She stepped out of the car and made her way to the front door. Her movements were slow, cautious, though she couldn't explain why. The house key trembled slightly in her fingers as she inserted it into the lock. The door opened with a quiet creak, revealing a home that should have been familiar but suddenly felt like foreign territory. Her footsteps were nearly soundless as she crossed the threshold, setting her bag down on the entryway table. The air inside was still, heavy with an unfamiliar weight, as if the walls themselves were bracing for something. She ascended the staircase, her heart picking up speed with each step. The glow from the bedroom light flickered through the slightly ajar door, casting a thin beam across the hallway floor. The closer she got, the more the air thickened around her, pressing against her skin like an unseen force. Pushing the door open, she froze. Jerome and Vanessa lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies entwined in a way that should have been impossible, unthinkable. The very fabric of her existence seemed to shatter in that moment, splintering into fragments too sharp to comprehend. Her mother. Her husband. Together. In their bed. For a brief second, the world around her went silent. The pounding of her heart, the rush of blood in her ears, the air moving in and out of her lungs, it all ceased, replaced by a void so absolute that she could almost believe time had stopped. And then, it all came rushing back. Their eyes locked onto hers, wide with something that might have been guilt, or maybe just fear. No one moved. No one spoke. There were no frantic explanations, no desperate attempts to cover up the betrayal that lay bare before her. Lisa's mind spun, a whirlwind of memories colliding with the grim reality before her. She saw flashes of childhood, of Vanessa braiding her hair before school, of whispered bedtime stories, of the way her mother had once cradled her when she cried over scraped knees. She saw the day she married Jerome, the vows they had exchanged, the love that had seemed so unbreakable. She saw every dinner, every holiday, every quiet moment they had shared as a family. And now, all of it was a lie. She felt something snap inside her, an invisible thread that had been holding her together suddenly breaking under the weight of betrayal. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her nails biting into her palms. A wave of heat rose in her chest, burning away the last remnants of denial. She had come home expecting warmth, love, and security. Instead, she had walked into a nightmare. Lisa didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, staring at the people she had once trusted more than anyone in the world, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Lisa did not scream. She did not cry. There was no desperate wail of anguish, no trembling hands reaching for an explanation that would never come. The heat of betrayal should have consumed her, should have burned her from the inside out, but instead, something colder took its place. It spread through her limbs like an Arctic current, numbing her, quieting the storm that should have raged. She turned away, her movements controlled, deliberate. The weight of what she had seen should have pressed her into the floor, but instead, it propelled her forward. She stepped out of the bedroom, closing the door behind her with a calmness that felt foreign. The sound of her own heartbeat slowed, steady now, measured. The air in the hallway felt thick, suffocating, but she moved through it without hesitation. Descending the stairs, she walked as if in a trance, her feet finding the familiar path through the dimly lit house. Shadows stretched across the walls, flickering from the streetlights outside, casting elongated shapes that danced along the furniture. The house smelled of lavender and warm wood, the comforting scent of home, but it felt alien now, stripped of its warmth. Her bare feet met the cool tile of the kitchen, the sensation grounding her in the moment. She reached for the silverware drawer, fingers curling around the handle before sliding it open with the smooth, practiced ease of 1,000 mundane repetitions. Inside, knives gleamed under the soft glow of the overhead light. She knew each one intimately, had held them in her hands countless times while preparing meals for the very people she now despised. Her hand hovered for only a moment before she chose one. The chef's knife, long and sharp, with a polished black handle that fit perfectly in her grip. The blade was cool to the touch, a stark contrast to the warmth that was beginning to simmer beneath her carefully controlled exterior. Her fingers tightened around the handle. She turned and ascended the stairs, each step slow, measured, the blade hanging at her side. Her breath was even, her pulse calm, but inside, something dark coiled, waiting to strike. The bedroom door stood ajar, spilling a sliver of warm light into the hallway. They were still there. Still tangled in sheets that did not belong to them. Still frozen, their bodies rigid, their eyes locked on her as she entered. They did not run. Perhaps they thought she would leave. Perhaps they believed there was room for words, for explanations, for something that could soften the blow of what they had done. But Lisa did not come for explanations. She did not come for apologies. She came for silence. The first strike was lighter than she had expected, the knife sinking into flesh with a resistance that surprised her. Warmth spilled over her hand, staining her skin, but there was no hesitation, no faltering. The second strike was easier. The third, effortless. A gurgled gasp filled the air, then another. Limbs jerked, bodies twisted, but there was nowhere to go. The sheets, once pristine, bloomed with crimson, the color spreading like ink across paper. The scent of iron mingled with the remnants of perfume and sweat, creating something sickly, something that coated the back of her throat. The knife moved again. And again. And again. She did not count the strikes. She did not register the sounds, the wet, muffled gasps, the slowing of movement, the eventual stillness. When it was over, she stood there, breath even, heart steady. The room was quiet now. Lisa lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, her hands resting limply in her lap. The knife, still clutched in her fingers, dripped onto the floor, leaving a pattern of red against the wooden boards. Her gaze drifted across the room, unfocused, lost somewhere beyond the present moment. She did not move. She did not think. She simply sat in the silence of what she had done. Morning crept in through the windows, pale and indifferent, casting long, muted shadows across the living room. The first rays of sunlight touched the edges of the furniture, bathing the space in an eerie, golden glow. Dust particles swirled in the stagnant air, illuminated by the light, moving lazily as if the world itself hesitated to stir. Lisa sat in the armchair, motionless. Her body had not shifted in hours. Her head was slightly tilted to the side, her gaze unfocused, drifting somewhere far beyond the walls of the house. Her hands rested limply in her lap, fingers faintly curled, as though she had forgotten what it meant to hold onto something. The house was silent. The kind of silence that was heavy, thick, suffocating. A silence that did not belong in a home that had once been filled with warmth, with laughter, with life. Now, it stretched out in every direction, pressing against the walls, creeping into the corners, filling the spaces where voices should have been. The scent of iron lingered, metallic and unmistakable. It clung to the air, mixing with the faint traces of her mother's perfume and the musky remnants of Jerome's cologne. A sickly, nauseating combination that made the back of her throat tighten, though she felt no inclination to move, to react, to acknowledge it. Somewhere in the house, the clock ticked. The sound was distant, barely audible over the weight of everything that had transpired. Lisa wasn't sure how much time had passed since she had lowered herself into the chair, since she had placed the knife on the coffee table, since the warmth of her rage had drained away, leaving only this vast, empty void in its place. She did not think about the bedroom upstairs. She did not think about the sheets, now soaked and ruined. She did not think about the bodies, still tangled in the remnants of their final betrayal. She did not think about anything at all. A ringing sound broke the silence. Soft at first, then insistent. The phone on the side table vibrated with each pulse, shifting slightly against the wood. It was a familiar sound, one she had heard countless times before, except now, it felt foreign, intrusive, unwelcome. The call went to voicemail. Then another came. And another. Lisa remained still. Outside, the sun rose higher, casting its unforgiving light upon the world. The street beyond the window slowly awakened, oblivious to what had transpired within the walls of her home. Cars rolled down the pavement, birds chirped, neighbors stepped out to collect their morning papers. At some point, there was a knock at the door. It was tentative at first, almost uncertain. Then firmer, more insistent. Lisa did not answer. Minutes passed. The knocking ceased. The phone rang again. Lisa remained seated. Her limbs felt heavy, weighed down by something she could not name. It was not exhaustion, though her body ached as though she had carried something far too heavy for far too long. It was not grief, though she felt as though something had been irreversibly taken from her. It was something else. A hollowness. A detachment from the body she inhabited, from the space she occupied, from the reality that she had created with her own hands. The ringing stopped. Silence reclaimed the house. Then, in the distance, a new sound emerged. The wail of sirens, faint at first, growing closer. Lisa did not react. The first officer arrived within minutes, stepping cautiously onto the front porch. The house looked normal from the outside, unassuming, a place that did not belong in a crime scene. He knocked, waited, knocked again. When no response came, he tried the door and found it unlocked. It swung open slowly, revealing the dimly lit interior. The smell was the first thing that hit him. A mixture of stale air and something heavier, something unmistakable. His hand instinctively moved toward his holster as he stepped inside, scanning the room. Lisa sat in the chair, unmoving, her expression vacant. The officer called out to her, his voice firm but calm. She did not respond. He took a cautious step forward, then another. The floor creaked beneath his weight. His eyes flickered to the coffee table, where the knife lay, its blade dull with drying blood. Another officer entered behind him, murmuring into his radio. The words possible homicide floated through the air, but Lisa did not hear them. One of them crouched in front of her, speaking gently now, as though afraid to startle her. He asked her questions. Her name. If she was hurt. If there was anyone else in the house. Lisa did not speak. His gaze flickered over her hands, resting limply in her lap. Dried blood clung to her skin, a stark contrast against her dark complexion. When he reached out to touch her shoulder, she flinched. Not in fear. Not in protest. But as though she had only just remembered she was still there. The officers exchanged glances before carefully lifting her from the chair. Her legs were stiff, her body unsteady, as though she had forgotten how to stand. They guided her toward the door, their voices low, speaking in measured tones meant to keep her calm. She did not struggle. She did not resist. Her fingers remained curled slightly, as though they still remembered the shape of the knife's handle. Outside, the morning light was too bright, too harsh. It reflected off the hoods of patrol cars, glinting in her eyes. The street was lined with curious faces, neighbors peering out from behind curtains, stepping onto porches, whispering among themselves. Lisa blinked. She did not hear the voices around her. She did not feel the cuffs as they were placed around her wrists. She only felt the cold morning air against her skin, and for the first time in hours, she took a breath. Bakersfield had seen its share of crime, but nothing quite like this. This wasn't just another case of domestic violence or a crime of passion. It was something deeper, something darker, something that made people shudder when they spoke about it. A woman had killed her own mother and her husband in their marital bed. It was the kind of story that clung to the public consciousness, spreading through whispers in grocery store aisles, between co-workers in break rooms, over dinner tables where families speculated in hushed voices. The media descended upon the case like vultures. Every news channel, every local paper, every gossip column carried the story. Headlines screamed about the Bakersfield butcher and the night of betrayal. Sensationalized reports painted Lisa Carter as either a cold-blooded murderer or a tragic victim of her own shattered reality. Television specials dissected her life, analyzing every aspect of her marriage, her childhood, her mental state. Reporters interviewed former classmates, distant relatives, anyone willing to offer an opinion on what could have driven a seemingly normal woman to commit such an unspeakable act. The trial was a spectacle. Every day, reporters gathered outside the courthouse, cameras flashing as Lisa was escorted inside. Protesters lined the steps, some demanding justice, others carrying signs declaring sympathy for a woman they believed had been pushed beyond her breaking point. Social media burned with debates, people arguing over whether she was a monster or a martyr. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Spectators filled the benches, eager to witness the drama unfold. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others because they felt invested in the outcome. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Lisa as a calculating killer, a woman who had planned her revenge with cold precision. They presented photographs of the crime scene, gruesome images that made the jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. Blood-splattered sheets. The discarded knife. The lifeless bodies. They detailed the autopsies, the number of stab wounds, the force with which they had been delivered. It was not the work of someone who had simply lost control, they argued. It was the work of someone who had wanted to ensure there was no survival. The defense countered with a different narrative. They spoke of Lisa's life, of her unwavering belief in family, of the betrayal that had unraveled everything she had built. They called psychologists to the stand, experts who testified about the effects of emotional trauma, about the psychological break that could occur when a person was faced with an unimaginable level of pain. They argued that Lisa had not acted out of malice, but out of raw, uncontrollable anguish. Lisa sat motionless through it all. She did not react when they described the bodies, when they recounted the night in vivid detail. She did not flinch when they played the 911 recording, her voice hollow as she told the dispatcher what she had done. She answered only when necessary, her responses brief, devoid of emotion. Jurors watched her closely, searching for signs of remorse, of guilt, of humanity. Some saw a woman who had endured too much, who had been driven past the limits of sanity. Others saw nothing at all, only emptiness behind her eyes. Day after day, the courtroom pulsed with tension. Family members of the deceased sat in the gallery, their faces tight with grief, their bodies rigid with anger. They whispered among themselves, shaking their heads as the defense pleaded for leniency. Some wept openly. Others stared at Lisa with open hatred. The judge maintained order, but the atmosphere remained volatile. Every cross-examination was a battle, every witness a new thread in the tangled web of what had happened that night. The prosecution pushed hard for a life sentence. The defense urged the jury to consider the circumstances, to recognize the unbearable weight that had driven Lisa to act. Then came the moment of deliberation. The jury filed out, leaving the courtroom heavy with silence. Spectators shifted in their seats, reporters jotted down notes, cameras flashed as Lisa was led from the room. Hours passed. The city held its breath. When the jury finally returned, the air became electric. People leaned forward, straining to hear the words that would determine Lisa's fate. The courtroom stood still, waiting. The courtroom was silent, thick with the weight of what was about to be decided. Every eye was fixed on the jury as they filed back into the room, their expressions unreadable, their movements deliberate. The air was heavy with the kind of anticipation that made people hold their breath, that sent a slow, creeping tension up their spines. Lisa sat motionless at the defense table, her hands resting on her lap, fingers lightly curled against the fabric of her prison-issued clothing. She did not shift, did not blink, did not search the faces of the jurors for clues. She only waited. The judge, an older man with weary eyes, looked over the assembled courtroom before turning his attention to the foreperson. The room had been packed every day of the trial, but now it felt smaller, as if the walls had drawn in just slightly, as if the collective focus of the crowd was forcing all the air from the space. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a dark blazer, stood with a piece of paper in her trembling hands. She cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the room. She read the verdict aloud. Guilty. A single word, yet it landed with the force of a gavel striking wood. There was no outburst, no loud gasp of shock or disbelief. The crowd responded instead with a series of low murmurs, whispered reactions rippling through the room like a distant wave. Some sighed in relief, as if justice had been served, while others stiffened in their seats, their hands gripping the edges of their chairs. A few shook their heads, their eyes downcast, unwilling to meet the reality of what had just been decided. Lisa did not react. She remained as she had been throughout the trial, silent, still, unmoved. She did not flinch, did not lower her head, did not turn to see the expressions of the people watching her. It was as if the verdict had not reached her at all, as if it had merely drifted past her like an autumn leaf in the wind, irrelevant and inevitable. The judge spoke then, his voice measured, authoritative, but there was something in his tone that hinted at resignation. He had presided over countless cases, had seen every variation of human suffering play out before him, but this one was different. The layers of betrayal, of grief, of rage, it had left a stain on the proceedings, something that could not be erased even when the gavel fell for the final time. 17 years in prison. No possibility of parole for the first 10. The words settled into the air, heavy, final. A few audible reactions slipped through the quiet, a muffled sob from the victim's family, a hushed exhale from someone in the back of the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, hands moving across notepads, capturing every detail for the next day's headlines. Lisa's defense attorney sat rigid beside her, jaw tight, fingers gripping the edge of the table as if expecting her to finally react, to show something, anything. But Lisa only nodded. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was there. A silent acceptance of what she already knew was coming. A verdict she had long since delivered upon herself. Her mother was dead. Her husband was dead. And with them, the Lisa who had once believed in family, in loyalty, in love, had ceased to exist. The woman who had once held her mother's hand as a child, who had stood beside her husband on their wedding day, was gone. She had been buried the night she had picked up the knife, the night she had crossed the line from which there was no return. The guards approached, their presence a reminder that the moment was no longer hers. Metal clicked as handcuffs were secured around her wrists. The weight of them was familiar now, no longer startling, no longer something that felt foreign against her skin. The judge's voice echoed in the background, formal and impersonal as he concluded the proceedings. The courtroom remained full even as the session was dismissed. Some stayed in their seats, watching as Lisa was led toward the exit. Others gathered their belongings, their conversations hushed, their expressions distant. She did not look at them. She did not look at the reporters, at the spectators, at the family members of the people she had killed. She kept her gaze forward, her footsteps steady, her breath even. She walked through the doors without hesitation, disappearing from view, leaving behind only the remnants of what had once been her life. The prison gates opened to a world that no longer felt like hers. Lisa stepped forward, her feet hesitant against the unfamiliar ground, the weight of 10 years pressing down on her shoulders. The sky stretched vast and endless above her, the sun too bright, too unfiltered after a decade of artificial lighting and gray walls. The air smelled different, fresher, carrying scents she had long forgotten, the crispness of morning dew, the distant burn of gasoline, the faint trace of flowers carried by the wind. There was no one waiting for her. She had known there wouldn't be. There had been no letters, no visitors, no whispered assurances that someone would be outside these gates when she walked free. She had stopped hoping for that years ago. Still, as she stood there, hands gripping the single bag of possessions she had been given, she couldn't shake the feeling of absolute solitude pressing in on her. Bakersfield had moved on without her. The city was not the same one she had left behind. The buildings looked newer, shinier in places, but foreign. The roads had changed, intersections redesigned, landmarks erased or replaced. The people who had once known her had vanished into their own lives, leaving no trace of the world she had belonged to before. She had no home. The house she had once shared with Jerome was long gone, sold after the trial. She did not ask where the money had gone or who had taken ownership of it. It didn't matter. That place had ceased to be home the moment she had walked in on them, the moment everything had shattered. Her former friends had drawn a line between themselves and her. They had mourned the crime, whispered about her from a distance, distanced themselves as if proximity alone could taint them. Some had sent letters in the first few months, words of shock and confusion, of tentative support or thinly veiled condemnation. Those letters had stopped coming long before she had stopped waiting for them. The city held nothing for her. She found shelter in a rehabilitation center for women who had lost everything, women like her, who had been released from prison only to find that the world had no place left for them. The building was old, its walls painted in faded pastels meant to be soothing, though nothing could erase the lingering scent of desperation that clung to the air. The residents there were drifters in their own lives, women with nowhere else to go, carrying pasts too heavy for most to bear. Lisa did not speak much at first. She moved through her days quietly, learning the rhythms of life beyond bars, struggling to adjust to the pace of a world that had continued without her. She worked in the shelter, cleaning, organizing, offering help where she could. The structure gave her purpose, something to anchor herself to when the emptiness threatened to consume her. But the nights were harder. When darkness settled over the shelter, when the quiet stretched too long and too deep, the past came creeping back in. The walls were different, the bed smaller, but the shadows were the same. She would close her eyes, and the memories would return. She would hear the sound of the knife sinking into flesh, the wet, muffled gasps, the final stutter of breath. She would see Jerome's face, twisted in horror, his mouth forming words that never had the chance to leave his lips. She would hear her mother's voice, calling her name, not in anger or fear, but in something else, something she still couldn't decipher, something that had haunted her even before the trial, something that had followed her into her cell, into her dreams, into the spaces between her waking moments. Some ghosts did not fade. She had long since stopped trying to banish them. Lisa learned to live with them instead. She did not seek forgiveness. Not from the world, not from the strangers who whispered about her, not from whatever remained of her mother or Jerome beyond this life. She did not expect redemption. What she had done was hers to carry, hers alone. But she had learned one thing in those 10 years. No one would ever take anything from her again. She had no family left. No illusions to cling to. Only emptiness and silence. And she had made peace with them.